So let's bring up Bill Franks, the Chief Analytics Officer from Teradata, and Dave Hastings, the Director of Product Analytics, Data Science, and Engineering at Netflix. And I think to get a really good flavor for what it is that a company like Teradata does is to hear firsthand from their interactions with one of their clients. So gentlemen, step right up and make yourselves comfortable. And I'm going to let you two take it over from here.
I'm really honored to be here today. Just give you a little preview of what we do at Netflix. Taking a poll of Netflix customers that are out there, more statistical poll, which is really cool, and I love the questions that are coming in. It's really a sense of the caliber of the audience here and the questions that you ask. And I think analytics are all about the questions, right? The questions drive what it is you're going after, drive the data that you need, drive the way that you deliver it, operationalize it, measure it, right? So it all comes down to the question. It's really cool to get the real-time stuff. But how many people have seen Daredevil? A good portion? Awesome. Thought that was an appropriate thing to kind of kick it off with the Age of Ultron starting tomorrow. So those of us that really geek out on comic book superhero stuff, it's really interesting to see the mixing of the big, high-budget Hollywood movies. Age of Ultron is, massive scale, as was the previous Avengers movie, and then to see Daredevil, which is something that works really well within the context of what we do at Netflix, right? It works very well in our universe, so to speak. But one of the cool things about Marvel is that all the different components of it are in the same universe and they're connected together. And so you may have seen a reference to the previous Avengers movie as sort of there's a lot of Easter eggs, but around the way that they actually got the rental for the main character of Daredevil to get his apartment was actually the aftermath of the big, huge alien invasion in the previous Avengers movie. And so it was really subtle and a lot of esoteric stuff in there, but it was really kind of cool, and it's very much all in the same universe. So going to talk today and with Bill around customer analytics and making it actionable at Netflix. There's a couple things. Netflix, I think as much as any other company I've ever seen, and I was a consultant for a long time, saw several hundred customers over the course of my time, 20 plus years out in the market, is as analytical as you can get as a company. And in a way, the foundation of the Netflix streaming business is an analytic. It's our recommendation system and systems as it gets expanding. The catalog was extremely limited in the beginning of the streaming service, and so recommendations and pulling up things that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise are extremely important, because a lot of the stuff that was on there at that time is stuff that you would have never thought of. So it was really the only way to get it going. But it's really the core of our business. We live and breathe customer. Every single day, everything is measured and everything is focused on customer. So I'm a slice of it, and we'll talk a little bit about what my team does here. Let's see if this other clicker, there we go. So another thing I like about Netflix is we're a small company, 1,600 people at the end of the year. Added like 187 last quarter, so definitely growing. Pretty focused on primarily one product. Netflix streaming is where the energy is going, and that's our big animal. And there's a few key things in strategy that are important that we think of every day when we wake up. First of all is be the world's leader in internet TV. And so there's a lot of things that come along with a leader. Obviously, aspirations to be the largest from a market share perspective are certainly there. I think that means creating the market, shaping demand. What is internet TV? How does that differ from linear TV? What kind of things can we do? There's lots and lots of questions around being that leader, and not all of them are directly tied to revenue, although we have that eye about what best serves the customer, with the idea that if you serve the customer well, you're going to be that leader. But definitely shaping demand. Original content, Daredevil you saw here, started off with House of Cards a couple years back, and I think we'll talk about that one a little bit later. But we're releasing over 60 original series over the course of this year, literally more than one a week. And it ranges from everything from big things like the Daredevil to Virunga and documentaries to Chelsea Handler late night that you can watch at any time of the day, which is going to be pretty fascinating when that comes out. So really interesting diversity of content, and we think that folks like HBO have been so good at original content for a long time, are people that we look up to in terms of being able to really have that quality and the full breadth of catalog that sits behind our originals too. And then global rollout's the other piece. We're in a large portion of the world right now, Western Hemisphere, is completely rolled out. We're in the western part of Europe. Just launched Australia and New Zealand like a month and a half back, which was a great addition. And next up is a few what we call Wave 3, which is Eastern Europe and Japan, which is very interesting because Japan really has no awareness of Netflix as a brand, virtually none. And so, to be able to even go into the market and have some kind of success, and there's other competition there, there's brand awareness and creation and PR that's really, really fascinating. Outside of my domain and product, but we definitely are going to piggyback off the demand that's created as soon as that goes live here in a little bit. Product analytics overview. So this is what I do. So I lead product analytics for our organization called Data Science and Engineering. So kind of three main focuses. So if you think of foundational data capture, it's our logging, or what we call consolidated logging, that integrates all the different devices that you can stream on a Netflix, mobile device, iPad, what we call 10-foot UI, TVs, and variations thereof. And to be able to integrate all those things together and get a common view of the customer is extremely important, and it's a huge amount of work because we're constantly changing the product. So that data foundation is very important. And then we call data pipelines, data engineering, getting that foundational data up to a place where it can be systematically analyzed, and then taking it up to more of a core data warehouse, high performance Teradata environment where we can ask questions extremely rapidly and be very, very nimble in that environment, and then be able to move stuff up through the pipeline. And then from the front end, everything from basic BI, standard reports. We do a lot of visualization, custom S3 stuff that's on my team, so data visualization engineers, and then data science that spans all kinds of different domains from research to extremely applied analytics that gets into the recommendation system. So pretty broad scope, but my slice is product. So as soon as you hit our .com site or any of our mobile device sites or whatnot, as soon as you're in there, that's in my world, and everything all the way through, if you decide to cancel the service, and then, the loop that might come back around. But we work closely with other folks on the team, including content we'll talk about too. One thing I want to talk about is contributing. Open source is an integral part of what we do at Netflix, and contributing back. Our engineers have been doing this for a long time, in kind of our core cloud technologies, ability to do streaming at scale. And Cirrus is our project out of my team where we're starting to take some of the analytic techniques that we use to enable some of our analytics we do internally and getting them out there into the market with the idea that they'll be utilized for a lot of people and we'll get value back by contributing back to the things that we're doing. So first couple, Score PMML just allows you to take a statistical model from any kind of package that produces PMML, package it up into a PIG UDF, user-defined function, and be able to score it at scale. We can run simultaneous models, do all kinds of cool things from that. And then RAD, which is anomaly detection, to be able to look at outliers. And outliers can be really interesting in the sense that it's fraud, bots, unusual kind of stuff. It can also just be bad data. And when you're dealing with really, really large data, there's always bad data, right? So finding that difference is important, but you have to identify what it is first. We're going to talk and let Bill kind of take it from here and guide the discussion. But I definitely want to hit on a point around enabling analytics. And in all the places that I've seen, the fundamental thing that enables you to be able to use analytics to solve problems, and the fundamental barrier to being able to use data and analytics to solve problems is culture. The culture is there, it's omnipresent, and if you're trying to get analytics to a place that doesn't use them, it can be extremely difficult to move that needle. And so at Netflix, I had the luxury when I came in of a company that's sort of built around analytics. And honestly, analytics are everywhere. Everybody's an analyst to a certain extent, and it enables us to do things that are very, very interesting. And in order to be the number one, we seek excellence, and that means quantifying excellence in every dimension: people dimension, product dimension, everything that we're communicating out. And so it's a very interesting environment to live in. And I think we'll just take it from here and start to dig down into questions.
So I'm actually in the role of Barbara Walters today, or maybe Megyn Kelly. I'd rather be compared to her, a little bit younger there. But I just want to dig in with Dave around some questions. I've known Dave for a lot of time. In fact, we were having a little reunion last night because we first all crossed paths with Pete Fader 20 years ago. Maybe it wasn't quite that long.
It was quite that long.
But and we actually, when we were both at IRI, we helped commercialize a new modeling methodology that Pete and some others had come up with. So it's sort of cool to be back chatting. So we've kept in touch over the years, worked together. Netflix has been a big Teradata customer for a number of years. So one of the things you hit at the end, and I think people have heard about, but I'd like to get your view, is this idea of really focusing on the talent that you hire and how you retain and acquire it. So I remember one of your quotes you mentioned when we were chatting is that you think your average person's about 2 times better on the typical day-to-day stuff, but 10 times better on kind of the creative and innovation and analytic skills. Sort of what does that mean, and how do you go about then maintaining a pool of people like that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We've thrown these terms around for a long time in the analytics space around people that are outstanding versus people that are good, and the difference is just, it's really hard to quantify, and there's all kinds of things that sit around the edges of making a truly outstanding person. So by the way, those questions, that particular thing I've adapted to presentations that I've done on data science and engineering, but I encourage people to go out and read the Netflix culture deck. Reed Hastings, our CEO, did a great presentation a number of years ago articulating our culture and how it works and how we approach things, and talent is a huge portion of it. So our goal is to really have the top person in whatever they do in the world at our company, as much as we can attract that talent and maintain them. There's a lot of things that sit around it, but the payoff is huge. I mentioned before that Netflix ended the last year with 1,600 people and $5.5 billion in sales, and so we're really a pretty small company given the amount of revenue that we do and the amount of complexity in the business that we operate. And the only way that that really works is having what we call talent density, having that critical mass of really good people at every single part of the equation. And from an analytics perspective, it means it gets pretty complex the way the organization works. But the net of it is that the sum of our parts is way bigger than us individually, but the individual people bring things to the table you could never quantify and put on a job description. Those intangibles always sit on the edge of whatever we try to quantify, and believe me, we do quantify talent pretty extensively, so it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, one thing, I know there's been a lot of hype around this idea that you did some modeling to predict and project what House of Cards would do before you invested in it. And I was at another unnamed network visiting recently, and they said something to the effect of, oh, that's BS. There's no way that they ran this model and predicted using all these things and then chose it. And I remember I said, well, let's assume you're right that they literally didn't, of all the billions of options of possible shows, predict this one. But I said, if they simply took the idea of this show and validated against customer data, whether they thought that show idea would or wouldn't be a success, I said, that's cool enough and different enough than what most people do. So I guess to the extent that you're able to talk about it, what's some of the myth versus reality in terms of some of the analytics you're doing around these custom shows, particularly the ones like House of Cards?
Yeah, I mean, House of Cards is a outstanding show, in a huge bet from our company to go and get into that business. We're a technology company, right? Going and getting into this highly creative production and creation of entertainment is a whole nother world. It cost $100 million to produce that show for the first season, and so obviously there was a lot of analysis that went into the production of that show. The fact that actually those kind of things get into the public mind, I think, is a measure of analytics and how visible they're starting to get. I mean, when we start to get to some measure of urban myth, urban legend around some of the things that we do, and especially when it's things like that are probably a little further out than what we actually did to create it, it's pretty fascinating. I mean, it's definitely the golden age of analytics. But I can say that, yeah, you don't make a $100 million investment without a whole lot of analysis. They have a huge FP&A organization that focuses on planning analysis, and a big part of that is around content and projecting the revenue and demand of TV shows. We obviously had a catalog of things that we didn't make before House of Cards was produced, and it gives us, with very extensive metadata around all those titles, ability to do a pretty good prediction of what a given title is going to do. But there's a pretty far gap between that, theoretically what it would do, and some of the things that I've heard around the fact that the whole show concept was created analytically, and that we just, threw the data into artificial intelligence and outcomes. Well, you need a Kevin Spacey lead with a David Fincher directing, and it has to be a political drama, and it has to, England is a great way to source it from, and there's a mini-series, House of Cards over there, go and take it, invest in it, and make it huge. Nowhere, right? In theory, you might be able to do those things in the long run, but that's quite a ways off. But we push it every day, and as we have more and more investment, $1.1 billion in investment in original content this year, with projections to be the largest producer studio in the world in a few years. Yeah, it's a big business, very important part of our business. And it's product I depend on it all the time. Because that content, if we don't have great content, all we do in the product is really irrelevant.
Well, I want to hit on a very surprising thing that not many people know. So how many people here have heard of the whole Netflix prize contest? It's sort of another legendary Netflix thing. See most hands, but the 1-minute version is, I don't know, it's probably been a number of years back now, probably 5 or more. They put out an anonymized data set, and the challenge was if you can, on the anonymized data set, build a model that when we apply it to a holdout data set that we have, beat our recommendation lift by 10%, you'll get $1 million. And thousands of people around the world on hundreds of teams competed, and it took about, 18, 19 months. And I believe it was pretty exciting. It's like a movie thing. 2 people submitted winning responses after 19 months within minutes of each other, and that was the difference for the $1 million, in part because part of the rules were you had to share back some of what you're doing, so they were all interacting. But the interesting thing, so everyone's heard that, that's really cool. Kaggle's sprung up to sort of commercialize that whole concept. But what I don't think most people know that would be interested is what happened to that winning solution when you actually went to implement it. So did it ever get implemented?
No, we didn't use it. It never got used. And the primary reason is because the way that the winning algorithm worked was a relatively large team of collaborators, so effectively had a blended model, crowdsourced model. And as you might imagine, you get a lot of really good brains together focused on one problem from a lot of different angles. You can beat a solution that would have lesser amount of energy put into it, but it was impractical to deploy just from a scale perspective to really do what they did and actually make real-time serve up your recommendations. And then just the sheer number of people that it took to really make that happen at that point really wasn't feasible economically, given the amount of money that you have to take to get those people together when you're not going after $1 million prize. But the learnings were very interesting. We definitely use a lot of that from there. And so in no way diminishes their accomplishment, just like I say, for those reasons, just was not practical to deploy at that time.
And this is the reason I want to bring this up. This is, to me, a huge theme. It's something I've written a lot about and we deal with in our customer base all the time, which is we're getting to a point today where there has to be trade-offs sometimes, and they can be uncomfortable trade-offs between the theoretically best solution, particularly at the scale of customer, and the actual pragmatic solution. And so the focus has to be on achieving a gain, not necessarily the maximum theoretical achievable gain, but the realistic gain that you can get. And I think this was a terrific example of going overboard on the theory on some of the teams without thinking about how would we actually deploy that. So even the last speakers had up, what was it, close to 100 million households with all of this detail from multiple different touch points. I mean, it gets to be petabytes. That's what we see customers analyzing every day. So I guess one question then is, obviously you have an issue with scale around your analytic platforms and all the analytics that you do, and it's probably a consideration in everything that you have to do. So how do you, at Netflix, even as you try and push the envelope, take into account the practical realities and sort of make sure you're going down a path that's going to work in practice?
Yeah, I mean, the practice is always chasing the ability to execute it at our scale. And obviously, Google's even at a larger scale than us, so they face these problems every day. We're a third of internet traffic at peak times. And so that means huge volumes of data to mine through to actually do what we do. And I can't get into the details of what we were specifically doing here, but we were looking at an option to be able to do some kind of measurement, improve our algorithms that required a change to our fundamental logging to be able to do data capture. And that single one change would have increased internet traffic by 1% in the world. And then we had to digest that stuff and make sense of it. And so we're going to get there where we can do that, but we can't keep like that whole 40-second stream for every single thing that happens. It's just not possible to keep that around for every individual. And so we have to be selective about what we get, and are always trying to push it. And that drives what we can theoretically do with it. And the value of the potential asset is one reason we explore it. And we can experiment and play around with logs and and do it at a small scale to see if it is going to make economic sense. But yeah.
Yeah, I think something you're hitting on there when you talk about being a third of the internet usage, which shocked me the first time I heard it. It sort of makes sense, but I don't think the average person's ever been aware it's that big. Sort of the analytics can't replace execution. In other words, you could have the best customer analytics knowing exactly what everybody wants, but if you're not going to actually deliver on the promise and or deliver a good experience, it's all sort of irrelevant. And again, you hit up on a pretty extreme end of the scale with that analytics execution. So I guess to the extent I'm picturing you must have, on top of all of the truly customer-facing analytics, much like a telco is analyzing the network traffic as calls are getting routed to keep an uptime, you've got to make sure that these videos are being delivered and not getting cached and pausing, for 10 seconds every 2 minutes. So I guess I got to believe, even though it's not as talked about publicly, that you've got a lot of things behind the scenes that aren't directly tied to a customer per se, but they're aimed at ensuring that customer experience is consistent and high. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And those measures are tied to customers internally, so we can measure service levels. So I talked about different aspects, and I have product, but inside a product is a real special area that really you're getting into, which is streaming. So we have a whole analytics team focused on streaming quality, and we actually quantify internet throughput on all the pipes that we go through to be able to make sure that final mile and delivering to the homes are actually getting high quality, pushing bandwidth to be able to get up to 4K speeds, be able to digest it. A lot of that data and analysis went into arguments for net neutrality and why that was important and whatnot, right? So yeah, it's somewhat esoteric because it does sit very much behind the scenes, but it's really, really important. And we sit around it, and again, what we do from a product would be irrelevant if the stuff doesn't get served up and you sit there spinning and don't get the data throughput.
So, I mean, it sounds like you're doing analytics across the business. Is part of your culture then that more or less if you're going to build something, you've got to be measuring and analyzing that performance from the get-go? And are there ever any exceptions to that? Is anyone ever allowed to do something just because it makes sense to everybody in the room?
No. And I can speak really on behalf of product the most because that's my domain, but I can say there is no change in the Netflix product that is not tested and validated. Now, it can be small scale, look at it, and it's also not tested if we don't believe that it has a probability of increasing a few customer measures. So we don't just test things to test things. If we don't believe it's going to improve experience, it will not get tested. It'll never make the product, even though it might be theoretically interesting. But we test everything. So we ran around 300 major tests of the product last year. And inside of those tests are dozens of variations on whatever it is that we're testing. And we're always putting new back-end platforms behind things. And so when you go into Netflix, you're part of a few experience probably in every single time that you go through. And hopefully it's improving your experience. And so nothing gets into the product without being tested. And the ultimate measures of success are very quantifiable customer behavior. So we look at, does it increase retention? Does it increase streaming? There's customer insights, consumer insights around the qualitative aspects that are really hard to quantify. And it has to pass all those bars to go through. There still are exceptions where the data says that we should do it and we decide not to. But those decisions get questioned pretty heavily. And those decisions are made by Reed, Hastings, and Neil Hunt. And they're debated in front of them and questioned if the data is not backing it up. But sometimes things like making it extremely easy to cancel service, we make it really, really easy. The data would say that you want to make it harder because that's going to increase retention. We say it just, even though that's true, ultimately that's not in the best interest of the customer, so we make it easy. You can turn it off in a second, and that's just how it is, and that's a decision that Reed made. It's philosophical, but it's really important.
Well, before we turn it over to the audience questions, if I'm going to be an appropriate Barbara Walters, I have to mention that I want to turn things to the story about your mom. We're going to dial her in a minute and address these family issues. Well, I'll let you off.
Why aren't they on Netflix?
So I think it's time to, I guess, open up for the questions that you guys are getting from them.
Yes. Let's first thank Bill and Dave for sharing some candid questions and comments. I'm looking at our most popular question of the morning. It's, what is Netflix? Is it a media business? Is it a service business? Is it an analytics firm? Pick one. Dave, what is it?
I mean, it's all of those things. It's ultimately an entertainment company.
Okay.
You know, you go on LinkedIn and you look at Reed Hastings' thing. It's entertainment, right? And internet TV is the business that we're in, and so that's really how we define ourselves, and everything else that needs to support that, from the the production, creation of content, all around our product, marketing, everything else is just in support of that bigger.
Because it's interesting that there's as many of the other questions that have come up, and I just think about and hear all the time, are just the other directions that Netflix could go in. And so if you really wanted to, you could be a heavy-duty analytics firm, and a lot of people interested in the idea of being able to predict box office sales and so on. So there has to be some temptation to kind of run with the analytics stuff, as an end unto itself.
Yeah, and I think, contributing back to open source community and going out and talking in the industry or getting involved in the design of data science programs and whatnot is a way to do that. But we're really careful about doing things outside of that core business, just specifically because we're small and you can be distracted, and if you're distracted, you can waver from being the best. And the opportunity is just so large to define our domain and become truly global, that those things, while theoretically they could make us money, are not done. And that includes pay-per-view, which is a business that we certainly could go in very easy, but aren't, even though economically that would make a lot of sense. We feel it's a distraction. It makes our revenue model more complex. And right now, it's really important to get out there and really be the best at what we do.
Yeah, if I could throw a comment, I was going to say, I think that question is important in that. I think it's a very common theme in industry today. I've written about this as well, about that. It's really getting very blurry in many cases what industry given companies are in, because they're spanning and crossing. So if you look at telco, your cell phone provider, AT&T is not just a phone provider anymore. They're providing the internet, which therefore gives them access to this data. They're providing TV, so we get into all these other things. They're spanning multiple things. You've got manufacturers. I like to use the example of like Nike with their fuel bands. I have on a Fitbit. A lot of you have them on. Well, now they're manufacturing and creating high-tech electronics, doing commercial software for consumers. They're housing data in data centers somewhere, and they're providing analysis back. Completely different from a fashion or performance sportswear business. So I think one of the things that every company needs to be asking themselves today is, given the data that we're now sitting on, how can that help us push into other spaces? And to Dave's point, not at the expense of your core business, but to the extent that you can put some resources off to the side to pursue some of these, and there are companies doing that. I know of companies who have groups established now, even VP levels, simply to commercialize the use of their data in ways that is outside of their core business. Of course, with privacy and all these other things taken into account. But it's a fascinating time today where I think a lot of companies are going to be morphing and twisting, and it may not be clear what industry they're in.
And I want to follow with you, Bill. So, we all talk about our perceptions of Netflix from the consumer side, but kind of, as kind of a vendor to Netflix, how do you see them? How do they stack up compared to many other companies that you interact with?
Well, as you can imagine, someone like them, a big customer, they actually help drive our offers and products. So, our cloud offerings, they were one of the early adopters of that, and really it was a partnership to help establish and roll that out and test it. And I can tell you they obviously are a good stress test for anything that you want to do in some ways. But I think that's how we see it. We love to get involved in helping customers and organizations like Netflix and others use their data, and particularly that customer data. That's really been one of our sweet spots for a long time, just because customer data is one of the biggest data sources that organizations have had historically, consumer-oriented organizations at least. And so, yeah, it's terrific to see. Well, I'm an analyst, so I'm biased, right? I love to see all this stuff happen.
Exactly. Good, good. And so that's a question. Back to being an entertainment business. Questions about do you see ad revenue in the future of the Netflix model?
No. Again, just in the interest of being focused.
Yep.
We're very much, a subscription service business at this point. But, from a demand creation perspective and bringing people into Netflix, heavy users of targeted marketing and analytics and stuff is a demand creation channel, and that's going to include a lot of sort of new forms of targeting that are just now becoming possible. But the core service, and I honestly, I asked our, just recently around this, and again, it comes down to the simplicity model. Anything's theoretically possible in the long term, but I can say that's not in the near-term roadmap at all.
It's interesting looking at the questions. Of course, all of you have the chance to look at them too. Besides some institutional details, many of which we've covered, a lot of people asking about kind of data and analytics. So for instance, how do you take into account the fact that that a particular user will have different tastes and different settings? How do you figure out what mood someone's in?
And you're right on it. Yeah, mood is an interesting thing to try to go after, because when you sit down in front of your iPad or in front of your TV and you want to come in to watch Netflix, we don't know your mood walking into that room. There's only so much information, even if all our digital stuff, digital footprint and whatnot that you have is in place when you sit down there. Your mood is still probably not all that apparent. But you can tell certain things by time of day, day of week. We have a concept of profiles, which allows you to go in, and around that profile, recommendations will be inside of that specific profile. Starting to look at things that allow you to sort of, as easy as possible, express what your mood is coming into the experience. And I'm sure you'll see a test coming out. If folks are streaming Netflix around that, love to hear what people think about it. We're certainly measuring it. And it's a fine line between getting enough information to really create a great experience and kind of getting creepy and asking stuff too much. And also, there's only so much time you have to be able to collect that information. It becomes distracting.
Yeah, I know. I've one of the little things I'll like to say on that topic is that even perfect data won't lead you to a perfect prediction. Meaning, even if you actually had accurately captured every single thing I've ever done, and it was accurate, and we know that even any kind of web browsing that you miss some points or it gets it gets loaded incorrectly in the database. Even if you know all that, you never actually, when it comes to people, have everything, because today's point. Suddenly today, I'm just in a different mood than usual, and even though you know that every day at this time I would go to such and such restaurant and buy a certain sandwich because I've done it 1,000 times, or sometime I'm going to decide, you know what, today I'm feeling crazy, I'm going to the other sub shop, right? And there's no way to predict that.
Yep.
So I think that gets back to that idea of collect all you can and make the best use of it, but you got to remember any individual prediction at any individual at a point in time has a high chance of actually being not correct. It's that aggregate that's really important. If you're moving the bar that across 1 million of those predictions, you're generating more revenue, that's great. But it doesn't mean that possibly hundreds of thousands of those didn't yield anything in that effort.
Yeah, think about it. I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow. I don't know what I'm going to watch tonight. So how is Netflix supposed to predict exactly what I watch tonight if I don't, right? They have insight and know my background, but yeah, at the end of the day, I could be in a completely different mood than I've ever been in history, and you have to adapt to that, and that's just reality, right?
So the name of our event here is Successful Application of Customer Analytics, but the question comes up, and I think it's interesting. What do you learn from Marco Polo?
Yeah, Marco Polo was, it was an interesting experience, pretty ambitious project, very clearly going after a global audience. And so it was, very, very successful. There's going to be a second season. It's very different than other things that we've done, and so the epic nature of it gives us a lot of really rich data to go after. And I think that those kind of things that really have strong storylines all the way through give you really insight into the way that people go and experience things, especially something like that also that's designed to come up on your 10-foot UI on your TV set, because it has epic scale, and so a lot of insight into 10-foot UI experience and what might or might not happen on the smaller devices where Marco Polo might not quite be as great of an experience because of the size of the.
Interesting. So we only have about a minute left, but I'm going to ask you a complex question anyway. Answer it fast. So you mentioned that there's a bunch of different parts of the analytics organization. In 42 seconds, can you just give us a quick overview of the different analytic pieces, how they fit together?
Sure. Yeah, so data science and engineering, again, I said it's foundational data all the way up through research around data science, and that's sliced vertically across a number of different areas of the business, but we all share each other's information, common data warehouse. We have a few other groups. We have a group called Science and Algorithms, which is hardcore research into new methodologies, testing out things that have never been done in the market. They focus on that exclusively, have a similar skill set to my team, but a very exclusive focus on new methodologies. We have algorithms engineering that takes what we do melds it into the product and makes it scale up. And that is a huge amount of work. I can't begin to tell you how much I respect what they do and be able to serve up that stuff as fast as they do. And then everybody else, our PMs and stuff, are all analysts. There's a product manager over our algorithms who knows more than I do about analytics and challenges me on a day-to-day basis, and he's my customer, which I've never had before, somebody and more analytically inclined as a customer, so it's really pretty interesting.
Very good. Well, Dave Hastings from Netflix, Bill Franks from Teradata, thanks very much.